empezando. Es un placer tener aquí esta tarde con nosotros a Felice J. Conocí a Felice hace unos años en el entorno de la Asociación Mundial de Investigación Educativa. Ella es una persona que viaja por todo el mundo y aprovechando que estaba estos días en Edimburgo, pues me fui y me la traje para que os hables. Probablemente tiene una visión muy completa, muy interesante de lo que se está moviendo en la investigación educativa en el mundo, que es de lo que os va a hablar esta tarde. Felice hizo sus estudios de bachelor, de máster y de doctorado en la Universidad de Chicago. Ahora es la presidenta electa de la Asociación Mundial de Investigación Educativa y es también la directora ejecutiva de la Asociación Americana de Investigación Educativa. Sus investigaciones se mueven sobre todo en el ámbito de lo que podríamos llamar la ética y la política de la investigación, cuestiones que tienen que ver con los investigadores, con el acceso a la investigación, con el acceso a los datos, cómo se comparte esa investigación, etc. Es mejor que la escuchéis a ella que la escuchéis a mí. It's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. So, thank you very much. Now we would like to listen to you.
Okay. Well, thank you all. The extent of my public Spanish is Buenas tardes. I studied Spanish in high school, but I'm many years since high school, although I miss high school a lot. So I know there's a number of master's students from biology background?
Yes.
Yeah. And education?
Yeah.
Excellent. So this talk is a little bit different than you might expect to hear, because I'm going to talk about the development of a field that Professor Jover and I are both involved in, and that is the study of education and learning, including the study of science education and learning. So view this a little bit more like a talk that you would go to in the arts and sciences than a specialized talk in your field. But I hope it's of interest to you, because the field we're in is very important in the development of knowledge that we hope helps in the practice and application of our science to learning about and applying principles of teaching and learning in the classroom and in the school and in the community, in the workplace and in the family. So first, I want to really say how honored I am to be here, both at the university and the graciousness of the dean and the associate dean here, to talk about trends and opportunities in education research worldwide. I want to thank in particular Gonzalo Jover, who since 2008, we've been colleagues together, working on the development of education research worldwide. And the fact for me, from the United States, that I now have dear friends and colleagues in Spain, in South Africa, in Taiwan, in Germany, in Mexico, in Peru, is one example of how important what we're doing is together, because even in a country as large as the United States, with as many researchers as there are, we can become very provincial, because we're overwhelmed by the number of persons who are doing research in our areas. Before I get too far along in the talk, and what I'm going to do is present some indicators and information about the field and our development and growth as a field. So it probably in part reflects my interest and background in sociology of knowledge and sociology of science. I spent many years at the National Science Foundation where I was interested in the development of all fields of science, including the social sciences and increasingly education research. So one needs to always thank people who've contributed to their work, and I have a team at the American Educational Research Association, not a big team, a little team of two others who work on a number of projects, including data and statistics and indicators and analyses, and they've contributed to this talk. Even though the American Educational Research Association is a very large association of 25,000 members, the staff that runs the organization is under 30. So we're smaller than most departments or schools of education. The theme of the talk is trends and opportunities in education research worldwide. I think that our interests transcend what happens in any one country, culture, or continent, and I hope that many of you who are early in your careers, including those who are planning careers in teaching most immediately, will think about how research applies to your work in the classroom, and as citizens, how it applies to how we develop sound policies and practices more generally. Just as the knowledge we produce will continue to be refined, enhanced, or modified as new circumstances, conditions, and tools of discovery take place, so too research fields, and we're a somewhat younger research field in the context of hundreds of years old. Fields that are really worthwhile are dynamic and capable of change. So I hope that education research will lead as a field and always be a work in progress, charting new directions, enhancing our assets, reducing our problems or our deficits through building better theory, more rigorous work of high quality, and data and findings that are more compelling and useful. And I think we find that doing this, being much more conscious about the world view, is very helpful in that regard. Today, my aim is to provide an overview of the field of education research in this international perspective. I've even borrowed heavily from my colleague, Gonzalo, who did an excellent presentation at the meeting of the World Education Research Association last November in Guanajuato, where we had a wonderful meeting. And the work that I've been doing on U.S. indicators in comparison to other indicators. So I'll spend some brief time focusing on the history and the emergence of the field somewhat from a U.S. perspective, but also trying to put it in a larger context, looking at the social organization of education research, capacity building in the field, the production and the diffusion of knowledge, and research and development support, what we call in research R&D support, the amount of support that the governments put into research in all areas, including in this area. While many of us, not everyone here, are part of the field of education research, depending upon our levels of specialization or orientation to knowledge, we may see this field in broad or narrower terms. Education and learning, as I see it, is really pervasive across society, even well beyond the schools. As a working definition, our field embraces the study of education and learning processes and the attributes, the interactions, the organization, and the institutions that shape educational outcomes. Even where we fall short of what we aspire to learn about, we very much try to be driven by studying innovations and by developing the tools and the methods that can add to our knowledge. Despite national borders, various educational contexts and systems in different languages, most typically the most important topics are really quite a bit more common than we might think before we look at what are the major fields in different areas. While in the US and in Spain, we may use different words, somewhat different words to describe these areas, such as social and philosophical foundations of education in the United States instead of educational theory. There really are quite consistent priorities. And this is Professor Jover's list of 12 from last November. Education theory, methods, developmental psychology, school organization, science education, social science, language, mathematics, arts education, music education, body language education, physical and sports education. These two areas also are present in the United States, somewhat smaller, I think, than they might be around the world. But if we look at the United States, you'll see similar topics, curriculum and instruction, and that tends to often include things like arts education, music education, and language education, curriculum and instruction, language literacy, mathematics and science education, child and human development, measurement, philosophical foundation. So you see, not unexpectedly, that similar issues really, almost with any country you would place, you would see that the core topics of study really don't diverge very much, including in southern hemispheres and in the Pacific and in Asia. In the United States, education research as an area of social scientific inquiry can be traced back to the last decade of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century, influenced by the social reform and social services impulses of the post-Civil War era in the United States, which was in the 1890s. Education research, along with other evolving social science fields and disciplines at the time, emphasized producing data, statistics, and information to address the challenges of industrialization and a society coping with issues of poverty, race relations, and the complexities of dealing with new immigrant communities. And that really sort of precipitated much more attention to education as a possible solution for dealing with societal problems in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. In 1867, the U.S. government established a federal department for the purposes of collecting and disseminating statistics on the conditions of education, because they were so worried about the gap between the educational system and the problems that we were facing in the United States. Education research in the U.S. began to take form and flourish during this period. Departments of education began to be established in universities, the first in 1890 at the New York University, and about the same time, the government in the state of California, they mandated that departments of pedagogical science be established in order to start dealing with the very difficult situation of education in the United States. Social science and education research associations emerged and formed during this period to develop and advance their fields. The American Political Science Association, for example, was founded in 1903, the American Sociological Association in 1905. In 1901, there was the founding of the National Association for the Study of Education, which was established to promote scholarly and scientific study. But that association only dissolved just a few years ago in 2008. Thus, the American Educational Research Association, of which I'm executive director, was founded in 1916 and is the oldest association for education research, I think probably internationally and certainly nationally. And indeed, our centennial celebration is in Washington, D.C., so we want everyone to come, of course. And we'll come to your meeting in 1916 as well. Education research associations are important part of the formal infrastructure of any field of research. And that's why I referred to other fields than I could have to the Mathematical Society or the Physical Society or the Biological Society as well. because these organizations help to provide a place to gather, to present papers, to meet and talk with other scholars, to present work early in what we call the knowledge development cycle, so that work can be critiqued before one submits it for scholarly publication. In the last quarter of the last century, largest research associations began taking on other program functions that support the field. Work mentoring young scholars, work on diversity issues and social justice issues to ensure more diverse students and scholars participate in fields. ARA, I think, is evidence of this transformation. The association's functions include ethical standards and research guidelines, professional development courses, research support for doctoral dissertations, initiatives directed to racial and ethnic minorities, and really advocacy in a way to try to encourage more national dollars dedicated to research to come both to the social sciences and to education research. So this table in particular shows the growth in education research of national associations, international patterns of education research association growth. And does anyone know where we would put the SEP? We know one person knows. So the 1949. This is right there. So the development of the Society of Education Research was very early on in Spain. During the last, so in the first 6 associations were established prior to 1960. So this starts sort of with ARA, a second, third, fourth, fifth, that's SEP, 6th, 7th, 8th. 6 associations were established prior to 1960. In addition to AERA, 3 were established in Asia, 1 each in Europe, SEP in 1945, and South Africa. Between 1960 and 1980, the total number of education research associations more than doubled. In 1970, the World Congress of Comparative Education Societies was also established. Also, a substantial number of Western European education associations were established in the 1970s. So you can see this growth up to 2012. Since 2000, the global expansion of associations that focus on the advancement of education research as a field of scholarship and inquiry has further grown. The founding of the Pakistan Association for Research in 2006, the Peruvian Education Research Association in 2009, the Slovenian Education Research Association in 2011 are just further examples of the ongoing expansion of the field of education research in South Africa, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. Also, the recent emergence of a second society, South African Education Research Association, in 2013, the second in South Africa, as an overarching society, is another indicator of sort of the development and the complexity of the field. Perhaps most important, I mentioned earlier, the World Education Research Association as really having, to a certain extent, I think, helped communities of scholars in different countries think both beyond their own borders and even thinking about how they could formalize in such a way that would help to enable the growth of the field. So the World Education Research Association, which was officially established in 2009, is an association of major national, regional, and international specialty associations dedicated to advancing education research as a scientific and scholarly field worldwide. And what the basic aim is of WIRA is that we're aiming to take on and stimulate activities that are global in nature and really transcend, go beyond what any one association can do in its own country, region, or area of specialization. And we work on capacity building, education, advancing education research policies and practices, and promoting the use and application of education research around the world. And that seems awfully ambitious, and so we're for a small group, we are awfully ambitious. But we hope not too ambitious in our goals and objectives. Just briefly, I wanted to turn to multiple associations related to education research within a country. In this particular table, because I had the information more readily accessible, is the United States, which probably undoubtedly has the most other associations. So that in the United States we have national education associations, and some 9 or 10. Reading it is not as important as seeing it. And then we have education research may be embedded in other national associations. So for example, the American Sociological Association has a section in sociology of education. Many of our states, separate states within the United States, have also education research associations that have meetings from time to time. Some have journals, most have meetings. And if you look at India, there are a number of states that have education research organizations. And then some of our education activity in the United States is divided by region. In Spain, there are also, how many do you think? 6 or 7. And I think that's one of the things we've learned, is how in many countries there are more than one. So there are multiple associations, with CEP being the oldest. Such associations simultaneously reflect, in the case of Spain, the history of Spain, specializations in the field of education research, and to some extent, as in the United States, what we call the silos, something of the separation that grows without too much interaction between the organizations. CEP now has an important opportunity, along with other affiliated education research groups, to strengthen and advance the field. And quite laudably, CEP is already aiming to undertake this task. As CEP President Jose Luis, I should have done this with you before, Gaviria, quite recently wrote, CEP is already working to open a space for dialogue with the rest of Spanish associations in the frame of the next Ibero-American Conference in Education to be held in 2016. So you have 2 good meetings to go to in 16. You have one in Spain, and if you want to go to a second one, you can come to the one in the United States. And this could be really a model, that CEP is taking this leadership role with the other associations to have a conversation about looking ahead in a way that's bigger than the parts. And we have not even begun to confront that challenge in the United States. In South Africa, there's a similar conversation going on from 6 or 8 other associations. The story worldwide of the emergence of education research associations and the development of our field in particular countries shows not unexpectedly that research emphases are embedded in the social circumstances of their time. And just to illustrate with CEP, the Spanish Pedagogical Society, Sociedad Española de Pedagogía, was founded, as I said, in 1949 in the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War. So see the analog between the U.S. Civil War. As set forth on the CEP website, considerable reflection and re-examination of pre-war values, approaches, and institutions in the post-war period led to major societal changes. In this respect, CEP played a significant role both in reconceptualizing new pedagogic models and in shaping the new education system in Spain. A major contribution of CEP was the introduction of empirical methods of research in the field of education so that we would have the data and the information upon which to develop appropriate and sound policies and practices. Except for the years in which this occurred, it is really quite similar to what I was pointing out in the United States, which is perhaps my most important point. I now want to turn to some other ways of examining trends and opportunities in education research. A limited amount of internationally comparable data actually exists into the health and the vitality of the field of education research. There's much more information in the physical sciences and the biological sciences than in the social sciences. And within the social sciences, there's less in education research internationally and definitely in the United States. The first indicator of the health, we like to think, and vitality of the field of education research is whether students and scholars are attracted to work in this area, as measured, at least one measure, by doctoral degree production. So here we see 8 representative countries, most of which are reported by the OECD, which made it handy. And you will see that Spain is here. The United States is here, and not all that different from Spain as a percent of the total doctorates. Here we see 8 representative countries from various global regions. Across this 10-year period, between 3 to 4%, 3 to 4% of the doctorates awarded each year in Spain were education science doctorates. But I want to emphasize that in South Africa and Finland, they have far fewer doctorates. So it's a larger percent, but the literal number is actually quite a bit smaller. The numbers in Spain range from about 250 of 6,900 doctorates in 2002 to about 350 of 8,700 doctorates in 2011. So the number of doctorates has actually increased by about 2,000 over the same period, or 1,500, 1,800 over the same period in Spain. In 2011, South Africa and Finland awarded the largest proportion of doctorates, but a not insignificant share of the total doctorates. Spain was comparable to the United Kingdom, and in percentage terms higher than US, Germany, Korea, and Japan. Given the large number of doctorates awarded each year by some countries, these figures suggest strong worldwide interest in the field of education research, because in each country it's not a huge proportion, but not an insignificant portion of the doctorates. So for example, in the United States in sociology, there are 500 to 600 doctorates in sociology. So the numbers of doctorates in education research in Spain are about comparable to the numbers feeding a field, bigger, what we think of as a bigger field, but isn't really in many respects, sociology worldwide. Looking at education science doctorates along with other social and behavioral science fields, we again see strong interest in these fields across countries, but again it's the same kind of ratio. Spain may, and the United States and the United Kingdom may look smaller than in South Africa in particular, or in Finland. I think it would be fair to say that in those two countries, in comparison to social science doctorates in general, there is a stronger presence and emphasis on education than in other of the social sciences. But as a proportion of the total doctorates, the actual numbers in the other countries are relatively similar as a proportion of the doctorates. So this is a picture that shows with just these 8 countries, large numbers of newly trained doctorates are entering the workforce each year. So in Spain, it's 5% of the workforce. Korea, 5% of the workforce. And these are interesting comparisons because the total number of doctorates in Spain and Korea, about 6,000, are about the same. So it's a similar proportion entering the workforce in the United States, just because of how large the doctorate production is, and that it's a large proportion. In Finland, and here is a good way of seeing that this is a smaller proportion entering the workforce. But this is not an insignificant number and presence at the doctoral level, let alone at the master's levels, in which many of you are pursuing your education, and maybe at some point you'll turn to thinking about returning for a doctorate, and you can help us with the research capacity building later in your career. We are a field that I want to emphasize. Some fields are quite linear. Persons move from secondary school to undergraduate education and then to graduate education. I think quite commendably, education and education research have often included many persons who work in the practice of the field and then pursue graduate education at another point, after often playing in very important leadership roles or running departments and programs as teachers and practitioners. Then there becomes an interest perhaps in stepping back and contributing both to building knowledge as well as to the higher education enterprise. A second indicator of trends, and I think I have 3, can be seen by examining where the top journals in education research are published. In 2012, based on the journal citation reports from essentially a company that does citations, meaning the frequency with which articles are cited by other articles. The company is called Thomson Reuters. They have an Institute for Scientific Information. 50 of the top 100 education research journals were published in the United States. So that might seem like a lot, but it's actually of the top journals, given that there are over 2,000 education research doctorates produced annually. It is worldwide a small number that the top journals include 50 published outside of the United States. The top 200 include many from Spain, I think, and in particular a system that we realize is problematic in its emphasis on English, which is an issue we are all working on trying to correct. This is an English firm, I believe. I think it's a UK firm, Thomson Reuters, but given that 50 are still outside the United States as the highest ranked peer-reviewed journals, is an important, I think, indicator of the worldwide interest in this field. Examining where these journals were established shows some interesting patterns. There was an early emergence of what are now top journals inside the United States, with 10 being published before 1950. 16 established in each of the last 2 quarters of the 20th century, and the remaining 8 since the turn of the century. So most are older journals. The top half of the top 100 journals are published outside of the United States, as I said, is a strong indicator of quality research worldwide. The Thomson Reuters data also provides a window of the overall impact of education research journals. Impact factors for scientific journals are calculated as a ratio of the total number of publication items that could be cited to the total number of citations for a journal. So if there were 100 articles that could be cited, if 50 are cited, it would have a higher impact than if 20 are cited. And these figures take the same 100 top-ranked journals in education research and shows that the average impact for 2012 and for the 5-year period ending in 2012 is comparable to other social science fields, with 2 exceptions, psychology and economics. These data indicate that the impact of education research journals, as I said, are comparable to journals in most other social sciences, 1.35 for 2012 and 1.62 over 5 years. As can be seen in these figures, the impact of education research journals are much like those in sociology, statistics and probability, political science and anthropology. Economics and psychology journals have a higher impact than journals in the other social science fields. I won't aim to explain it. Psychology is a large field with a big practice part of that field, though no larger than education research. Economics, not as large a field, or certainly no larger than education research. But it is a field that has a lot of adjacency to policy and practice, and I won't speak to how much social influence it should have, but is a high prestige field in many countries in the social sciences. The proliferation of education research globally is illustrated in this figure. It shows that the patterns of growth this second slide is on the number of citable documents in education research. So for those in the field, of course, this is one of the more reassuring slides, that the patterns of growth of citable documents increases around the world. North America, as one can guess, not because it produces more citable work of relevance, but it had 50 of the most cited journals from the 20th century, and that sort of begets itself. So for us, the more important pattern is the similarity in Latin America, in Asia, Asia, and Western Europe. They're all increasing in scholarly work being published and cited. The picture in Spain is also really quite impressive in terms of citable documents in Spain, education journals that are cited from the same source, not self-citation, but I think we'll have another sociology of scientists comment on this, but I think in particular, given the domination of English in so many of these journals, the cross-citation pattern is really quite impressive. I charted it only for Spain by country coming here today, but this brought to my own mind, given this pattern, that it's worth looking now at some of the other countries singularly to see how they're contributing to this overall quite impressive increased citation rate for education and education research. The third indicator that I wanted to speak to is by looking at the investment of government funding in education research. And perhaps it's different, but I doubt that to be the case, that the largest funder in this R&D, research and development, although there's some private sector investment, the largest of the small amounts that go into funding in different fields tends to be national governmental funding. And so here we're looking at government funding. And here I compare, shows the data in purchasing power parity. And that's a term that I was not too familiar with before the last few years, but it's term much more familiar in economics, which is the number of units of a country's current currency required to buy an amount of goods and services in that country's domestic market as a US dollar. So it's converted to US dollars. It's an OECD number, but it is in the currency of each country. And so this gives some comparability across countries. Looking at these 6 representative countries, we see that the United States and Germany spend more on research and development for education than Spain and Japan, the United Kingdom and Finland, but that Spain, everything's been going down, unfortunately, but that Spain is the highest among the 4. What is perhaps a more interesting story, however, is how these investments in education research compare generally with total non-defense and development outlays in these same countries. So this is looking at the percent of education called by the OECD an objective as part of the non-defense funding. And this is a quite impressive pattern for Spain. Across these 6 countries, research and development expenditures for education were about 1% or less of the total. So this total is not a large difference, but I think an instructive difference. Total non-defense R&D outlays between 2007 and 2012. In all but 2 of these years, Spain spent a larger share of its R&D outlays on education than the other 5 countries shown in the figure, with outlays ranging more than 1.3%. So those are small percents. We wish there were more of an investment. I suspect nobody will go home today feeling, oh, this is great, because of course all the percents are much too low, right, for those of us in a field like this. But there is a foundation to build on, or at least a comparative foundation for us all to build on, in looking at the relative investment in different countries. So while the United States might have appeared higher on the last chart, as a percent of non-defense R&D, research and development that's not oriented to defense, it's not high. It's only high in absolute dollars. So those are some of the 3 kinds of indicators that I wanted to draw upon today: the doctoral production, the publication patterns, and the investment in research, to give an overview of the current state of affairs for education research as a field. Some of the ways it's been developing in terms of indicators and dollars and statistics, and most importantly, I think the influence of the scholarly knowledge as reflected by its citations and use worldwide. And I think it would be certainly reasonable to say that we do have something of a worldwide presence, and yet we have opportunities and challenges. So one big challenge that has become increasingly clear to me, having been trying to pull these indicated data together now for a couple of years, and I suspect that Gonzalo, you've been equally as challenged as you've been looking at similar indicators, is that the information about education research that is comparable to other fields or across national borders does not exist. So you could see that South Africa dropped out of the picture because it's not an OECD nation, and I could not pull something that was actually comparable. I had some other charts when I spoke this summer in Durban at a meeting, but I couldn't get the comparable data because it doesn't exist. Countries use different taxonomies and terminologies, with some countries considering education research a social science and others including it with the humanities, and some we're not 100% sure where it's included. Even in the federal data sets in the United States, education research is not classified as a scientific field for certain purposes, and thus we have little data on the workforce in the United States. AERA and SEP and other education research associations, I like to think, need to kind of think about, that's one of the kind of roles that a WIRA can potentially play, how we can improve our data, what kinds of data we need in our countries, what kinds of indicators would tell us more about our fields, so that we can have more comparable information across fields, within our field across countries, and comparing education and education research to other fields within our own countries. The presence of WIRA provides us with an excellent opportunity to leverage the research being conducted in countries around the world in order to advance education research within our respective countries. WIRA helps to strengthen the identity of education research worldwide, or we like to think that that's a key goal and ambition, and represent the values of the field to those who have interests within each of our countries and national borders that may be in other areas of research and inquiry. SEP, AERA, and other research associations also have the opportunity to help shape our shared research and data agendas. Sharing research findings across and within domains of inquiry, as well as across borders, will advance and hone our research agendas. And data sharing will provide researchers in countries with limited resources access to robust data. And one of the biggest concerns is, of course, collecting information is so expensive. So we need to kind of think through together what would be useful to have and how we share it in such a way that removed of the resources in a country, or the resources that faculties may have in different universities, there's some common data elements that many can use and benefit from in an ethically responsible way. Also, AERA, SEP, and other associations should commit to high standards of quality in their own work and in fostering policies and principles that engender high quality and in training our next generations. And I only spoke briefly to your dean, but I know quality research is or quality in education and research is a strong interest of hers, and I thought, we need to be thinking about the indicators used here and the ones we should be using in the United States. WIRA may be able to serve as a facilitative platform for those kinds of discussions. Education research associations also have the opportunity and the responsibility to elevate the visibility and sound use of research with practitioners and policy makers. And I think in particular, for those of you who are in the MA programs and seeking to move into secondary education as teachers or educational leaders and practitioners, we hope that we've produced the kinds of knowledge and the kind of information and the kind of data that will be useful to you in your own careers and your own lives in practice and policy. And to the extent we fail, when you hit the kinds of questions to which you feel that you don't have the knowledge or the tools and the information that you'd like, well, then you go to Dean Jover and Associate Dean Jover, and you say, well, what do we have here that we can use, because of the challenge sometimes in translating what we do in research into the real world circumstances. Though I think that in education research we take that challenge and that need especially seriously. So I want to conclude this talk sort of on the spirit where I began, that we need to pursue research and innovation collaboratively, whether we're in research or policy and practice with respect to our field. The study of education continues to be, just as it was in the United States post-Civil War, and with the social changes and that animated life in the United States still does at the turn of the 20th century, and still remain some of the most pervasive and insidious kinds of problems that we face that require resolution. There is wide recognition across countries and cultures of the importance of understanding the dynamics underlying education and learning for diverse populations. Education is generally understood to be central to critical thinking, to social development and cognitive skills across populations, to persons having access and pathways to realize their full social potential, and to a productive and internationally sensitive and empathetic and appreciative world order. Even in countries where education may not be universally available or is closed in access to certain segments of a population, we hope that leaders have access to research and teachers have access to research in such a way to more fully comprehend that education is an essential function of society and that its universality is a moral imperative. This pervasive interest can be seen in the social organization of education research as a field and profession, and the changes therein, we hope, are seen in that light. Just as education is ubiquitous in society, so too is education research. Nonetheless, the presence of a dedicated field offers a venue for incremental building of bodies of knowledge, for interaction within and across scholars, and for a framework of what we like to think is intergenerational transmission of the methods and substance that would not readily evolve if we were just a set of disparate areas of inquiry. Part of the measure of any field is the capacity to build and produce usable knowledge, to create opportunities for interaction, even where interactions or crossovers do not exist. As emphasized in my remarks today, education research has always been defined and marked by a porous identity. It's not your household term as a field in many households. While at times a point of concern and critique, the dynamic pretends well, but I think the openness of this field has really been one of its assets. And I think its adjacency to policy and practice another. There's a lot of porousness that I think makes the field richer and generates internal challenges that animate what we do and help to expand and transform and help us redefine our commitments. So I welcome continued conversation and converts, as we say, on this topic. I've been impressed that our Society Association, SEP, has already committed itself to a leadership role in its 2016 commitment at the Ibero-American Conference in Education, and I hope that whatever career paths each of you who are students in the room decide to pursue, that you'll come away with some sense that linking research and knowledge and statistics and data to what you do and helping us as practitioners and observers to clarify our questions and critique our knowledge is something that you participate in for many years to come. Thank you.
So,
We have time now for some questions. Tenemos un micrófono por allí, si alguien lo quiere usar, que lo pida.
Hi, my name is Arturo Galán. I want to thank you are here on behalf of the Sociedad Española de Pedagogía. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. So I would like to know your opinion about the impact factor. I mean, for Spanish journal, the Sociedad Española de Pedagogía have a journal that by chance we apply for the Web of Science last week.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very difficult for our journal, I mean Spanish journal, to access to the Web of Science. I think it's because the language maybe And now we have 6 journals in the Web of Science, but 2 of them were dropped because of the number of sites in the rest of the journal of the Web of Science. So it's so difficult for us to keep there and to accept there. So do you think the scientific science production in Spanish is going to be more considered, or you think we have to write mainly in English? Thank you.
Excellent question. And what I tried to say is that it's a very imperfect measure dominated by a corporation that has been developing this indicator for years. I think there is increased sensitivity on the part of Thomson Reuters that the measure is both too dominated by US journals and too dominated by English. So, for example, with a new journal that AERA wanted to, or an old journal that was not included in the ratings, Educational Researcher, they now require we show the number of non-US scholars on the editorial board and the presence of authors from around the world as part of at least the application. I think the overall trends, when you look at the Scopus data, look more favorable. It is a very big problem that one language, English, dominates. I think one of Gonzalo's slides looks at the journals, with the 6 journals or the 8 journals within your own country. That's probably a better indicator of the relative demand and interest in the journal than doing an international comparison. It's hard to know how this might work itself out over the next years ahead, but I think organizations like WIRA, and I think by virtue of the existence of WIRA, organizations like AERA are much more concerned about the problem. So I think it's a problem to be solved, and we are very conscious of the fact that that in every non-English speaking country, that we should not be seeing that as the preferred mode of scholarly communication. So that we are concerned, and talked about at our meeting just this past week in Edinburgh, that students, and the graduate students raised this issue, that students may be sort of mentored into writing in English so that they could publish in more competitive journals, or those highly ranked, as determined as more competitive, than in Chinese or Japanese. Japanese has a pretty internal system. So I think that with a worldwide sensitivity, I think it's a very clear issue on the agenda, and one that we should address, and we welcome your collaboration on that.
Podéis preguntar indistintamente en inglés o en español. Si lo hacéis en español, yo intentaré traducirla.
So I should, if I could just add, apropos of your question, I feel diminished that I can't speak today in Spanish. That's not great. You know, ideally, I would be coming here with the competence to be able to communicate what I wanted to say in Spanish. And that to the extent you struggled, and to the extent you struggled, it was because not today, but then we could say to the extent you struggled, it was because I was not precise or ignorant, but or confused, which I could all be, but not because I was speaking in a language that didn't as readily communicate. And that's the kind of thing I think that this collaboration across us is making us all more sensitive to. Certainly in the United States, which is also so heavily Spanish speaking, it's a very prevalent kind of conversation about being able to be comfortably multilingual. In other countries we're a family, they are dominated by other languages, particularly in Asia.
Okay.
It's not a question, it's a request, an address. I could like, how can I say, maybe your speech was really interesting for me, and I think so for most of us. There are many information about statistics, years, countries, amounts. Do you think that it's possible that we can get some copies about your speech in order to focus on a different statement and to reread and to get more information about that? Do you think so? That could be possible?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I could even provide the data from the extra hour that I managed to cut out.
All right. Gracias.
I'm in the United States what we call a data wonk, and somebody who likes to look at the numbers. So
Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering about the rationale behind the cases you selected: Finland, Germany, Japan, Spain, United Kingdom, United States. I was wondering, for instance, why not China, which is now not on the top. Korea, well, it was just a sample you choose.
well, it's a very interesting question that speaks to my first concluding point that comparable data do not exist in many countries. So the struggle I had when I was speaking in South Africa, I had to try to find something that was the equivalent. So I took the countries, I tried to not take too many so it could be on one table, so that's one. But I took the countries where there was the longest reported information. And so some were just beginning to report, and some aren't OECD and there's no report at all. So that's why I emphasize the importance of thinking about what would be comparable indicators, and maybe some group like WIRA could sort of begin thinking about that, where at least we have a few dozen that we think, or 24 that we think that if we could get something like that, then we can do some comparisons over time.
Yeah, because even the Spanish data, I think it's a little bit biased, because there are some studies that say that a big chunk of this money is going to defense under different columns. So yeah, it's
Under non-defense, right?
Yeah, it's a big problem always to compare raw data.
Yes, yeah. So that's the other problem, is that even
Having
the comparability of what's under the construct. It's a big problem in all of, sort of all of research, that particularly when you do comparative, kind of comparative work. If I were, in all of our cross-cultural or international work, if we were talking about teaching methods, then we'd want to operationalize it for, okay, well, what is it actually? So you're right. It could be that what compositionally went into non-defense and defense might vary. I was trusting the OECD to have it somewhat comparably, but I see on your face you have my same reservation.
I would like to ask something in behalf of master degree students. When I attend meetings in the States or in other European countries, I see a lot of teachers presenting research at the conferences, but this is not the case in Spain. This is not something there. So here, the role of teaching and the role of research seems to be very, very, very separated. So what do you think about this?
I think I was trying to be a little bit of a missionary. I didn't know it was separated, but in the United States there is engagement of teachers in research, and practitioner research is considered a very valuable part of the knowledge base. And so to develop the methodologies for practitioner inquiry, to be sure that one pursues that work with some degree of objectivity, meaning one might observe the classrooms of a colleague versus one's own classroom, or colleagues in addition, but it's a pretty healthy area, including teacher practitioner journals. So at AERA, at every annual meeting, there's any number of sessions in presenting practitioner research. And I think much more, as importantly as that, is what I was also saying, that helps improve the questions being asked by the non-practitioner researcher, because it needs to be taken into consideration. And we have a long way to go too, but it's in the MA programs, it's very much included in the training, as well as the teacher preparation training, or I should say in many MA programs. The fundamentals, not just of doing practitioner research, but also being good consumers of the research. That's very important, so that you're not misguided by the latest article or the latest fad, that you're an intelligent sort of consumer of research. So when Gonzalo said he was teaching policy in the MA level program, I thought, well, very good, that's good, because in almost every profession, one can get tricked into thinking something that seems to be face appealing has merit, and you want to be, you really want to be, you want to potentially contribute to the production of the knowledge from the vantage of a practitioner, but also be adroit consumers.
Okay, so thank you very much, Felice, and thank you very much all of you.